they started to enjoy the juicy and nutritious frog meat together. Suddenly, something caught the main character's attention, making him look up. As it turned out, it was the system spirit Ruhua who appeared out of nowhere and joyfully began to congratulate him on receiving the treasure chests, which this time was even more. Hearing this, the protagonist with a smile said finally. He waited for the upgrade opportunity for a while, and today, that moment come. After a while, after eating the last of the meat and making a burp, he declared that he was full. Sitting down with a puffed-up belly, he happily announced that this time he was able to get as many as 5 chests. And since the gecko warrior already couldn't fulfill his duty of choosing a chest, he had to do it himself. So he simply told Ruhua to open the middle one. Shining with a golden light, the chest opened. As it turned out, the reward from the chest this time was a B-level sweet potato gene, with which his system spirit immediately congratulated him on. The system window reported that sweet potato roots were divided into 3 forms: fibrous, woody, and tuberous. It was also reported that the main function of tuberous roots was to store nutrients and reproduce. After reading this, Wu soon wondered if he even needed this gene. Turning to the system spirit, he asked what the benefits of this gene were after the fusion. The system spirit immediately began to explain, saying that if he just buried the food scraps in the soil and let them decompose, it would take a long time and was wasteful. The sweet potato gene, on the other hand, allowed the processed food to be stored in the roots. Upon hearing this, the protagonist asked incredulously, what was the use of roots that hid nutrients? Did they really need to be dug up and eaten when hungry? However, Ru Hua refuted his theory, saying that he directly took nutrients from there, which could allow him to thrive even when food was scarce, as well as treat his injuries and recover quickly. Hearing this, Wu soon immediately had an image in his mind in which the bottle of recovery potion in his hand was his roots. This made his eyes glisten even more with anticipation, and he immediately impatiently told the spirit to quickly start fusing. In the next second, the protagonist was surrounded by a bright green light, while the system window reported that he had successfully merged with the red potato gene, which allowed him to quickly break down food into nutrients and store them in the roots. The note said that now his mother would no longer have to worry about his malnutrition. However, to his bewilderment and confusion, he did not feel any obvious change. Seeing his confusion, Ruhua told him to try using his mind to manipulate the roots and allow them to store food inside him. Hearing this, Wu soon stared at the toad. But in the next moment, he did not take his eyes off of it, and as if reading an incantation, he began to mutter words about wanting to store food. A moment later, he could feel the roots, which immediately rushed to the top. After breaking through from the ground, they immediately began to braid the frog's body. Seeing this, the protagonist could not help but rejoice that everything worked, and also so quickly. He could clearly feel the root systems wrapping around the food and carrying it to the root for storage. It was incredibly convenient because now he no longer had to dig holes and worry about someone eating his food, or it attracting the attention of others. On a future hunt, he decided to test the restorative effect of the sweet root, which was analogous to a bottle of recovery potion that could be equated to 1 life. And if the root was improved, he would have even more lives, and the probability of him surviving would increase greatly. The opportunity to test the new skill did not have to wait long, because after a while, he was attacked by a large red snake, which immediately rushed at the protagonist. However, he did not plan to lose, and controlling his thorny vines was able to stop her. However, he didn't stop there. He immediately took advantage of its hiccup, wrapped his vines around it, and slammed it to the ground. Realizing that the snake was still alive, Wu soon used his secret technique called the enraged killer gecko that killed exclusively with bones.
At a tremendous speed, he forcefully thrust the bone into the body of immobilized snake. After a while, the dust that was raised during the fight began to disperse. This video, on the ground, the dead snake was still twitching in its death convulsions. While Wu soon praised his yellow friend and said that they made a great team, then turning his gaze to his vines, which had snakebite marks, he noted that even though the snake was poisonous, it was not a problem for him because snake poison is useless against plants. Snake poison acts through the bloodstream and attacks the nervous system, muscles, heart, and respiratory system. Fortunately, our flower didn't have any of that. The next moment, his root glowed with a bright green light, indicating that healing had begun. A few seconds later, after inspecting his vine from which any wounds had disappeared, he proudly noted that this healing ability from his root was very good.
However, nothing could be more important than dinner, which they happily picked up their improvised cutlery and immediately began to eat. While they were enjoying the snake meat, dark clouds covered the sky and rain began to fall. Ruhua, sitting on the chest, hid under an umbrella, while the protagonist, along with the gecko, were without shelter. But Wusun immediately remedied this by weaving his vines into a canopy to protect him and his yellow friend from the rain. Looking at the contented gecko, who was sleeping peacefully and snuggled up to him, he said to himself that he felt more and more attached to his territory, for here he now had food, drink, and a cute little pet. For a moment, he said dreamily, the only thing he was missing was a girl. However, a premonition of impending danger brought him to his senses, and he looked perplexedly ahead of him. As it turned out, there was an amorous system spirit flying straight toward him, who spread his arms and asked if he was his girlfriend. However, a few barbed balls thrown at him quickly remedied the situation, having fought off the attack of Ruhua, who was now lying knocked out. The protagonist wondered if he should look for a large female flower if he wanted to find a girl. However, the image that appeared in his head did not particularly please him, so he decided to leave it for later. It's been over a month since our protagonist turned into a flower. During this time, he managed to grow another spiky vine, as well as 2 more roots, which equaled 2 more bottles of healing potion. Throwing the spiky ball into the air and catching it again, Wusun boredly wondered why his yellow friend hadn't returned from the hunt yet. Suddenly, the sound of rustling leaves behind him caught his attention. Turning around, he wondered if the gecko had finally returned from hunting. But what he saw made him freeze in shock. There was a man standing there with a backpack on his back and a hiking bag for herbs hanging from his shoulder. While the man was looking around, Wusun couldn't be happy that there were also people in this world. In an attempt to attract attention, he immediately started waving leaves and shouting loudly and happily, saying that he had finally met some of live people in this cursed world. But the next moment he realized that he himself was just a strange flower with a big mouth, and that the only thing he had in common with humans was the ability to think and speak. So first, he decided to say hello and connect. Since he didn't know much about this world, he was going to ask the man a lot of questions. He immediately started yelling loudly. However, without noticing the protagonist, the man passed by. Watching the man bending over the ground, Wu soon was puzzled as to why he didn't notice him and whether it was because he was small. But what interested him even more was what he was doing now. Suddenly, there was the sound of roots being pulled from the ground. With a smile that seemed devilish to the protagonist, the man happily said that he didn't expect there to be such a precious toxin-cleansing plant. This scene before the protagonist made him realize 2 things. First, that the man was gathering herbs, and second, that attracting attention was the biggest mistake he had ever made in his life. After sticking a small shovel into the ground, the man began to dig up the flower. He held it in his hand and said in a joyful voice that he was incredibly lucky to find such a flower, because it was the main ingredient for the longevity pill. The protagonist, on the other hand, was watching all of this with apprehension. Turning his gaze to himself, He panicked and said to himself that he was now the only flower in the area, and he hoped that perhaps he would not pluck it and use it to make medicine. However, his hopes were not to be realized. Putting the flower in his bag, the man looked around and thought that there must be other valuable herbs in the area. After the man's words, Woosun's eyes widened in horror, and the hope he had had vanished in an instant, for he realized that this was his end. As expected, the man discovered him rather quickly, while smiling his devilish smile. However, he did not immediately tear it off. Pensive, he wondered why he didn't have any information about this flower. Taking out a book, he decided to check if there were entries about this flower in it. But to his disappointment, he couldn't find anything. This interested him greatly, and the manic smile of a discoverer appeared on his face. Thinking that he had discovered a new medicinal herb, the man holding a shovel in his hand, which to the protagonist was tantamount to a murder weapon, reached out to Woosun, intending to dig it up and study it later. Our flower was frozen in fear and could only stare at the hand reaching for him, and mentally shouted at him not to touch him with his filthy hands. Luckily, his survival instincts kicked in, and he unknowingly struck the man with a thorny vine, which the man's hand stumbled on. When he felt the pain, he immediately cried out painfully and yanked his hand away sharply. Looking at the torn glove on his hand, he wondered why the strange flower had so many thorns. However, their presence only made him more interested, and he decided to continue, but now to be more careful. His hand, accompanied by a devilish smile, reached for the protagonist again. Only this time, Woosun really realized that this was his end, because even with his thorny vine, he was only able to cause minimal damage. With a look of horror on his face, he resigned himself to the fact that he was powerless against absolute power. The man's hand was about to grab him, but suddenly he was distracted by a noise behind him, causing him to turn around. A silhouette was approaching them. Recognizing his partner, the man asked him why he had returned so quickly. He was carrying a large pink egg in his hands. When the man saw him, he was surprised and asked him how he could do it so quickly. However, to his bewilderment, the man said nothing and ran past him as if he was in a hurry. When he turned around, he shouted in panic that he should run away too, because the dragoness had noticed that he had stolen the egg. These words shocked and horrified him, and sweat immediately broke out on his face. While the guy with the egg in a panic continued to run away, his partner looked up into the sky and saw a large silhouette that was approaching them at a great speed. It was none other than a huge dragon whose mood was as horrible as its appearance. However, even after seeing Dragon, the man did not leave the desire to dig up the strange flower, but his friend called him crazy and shouted that it was not the time for that. The protagonist was also not very happy about this, and irritatedly thought to himself why he did not just get out of here. Despite the extreme situation and his friend's shouting, he was still hesitant. But even this greedy guy valued his miserable life, so he followed his friend and turned around and said that he would definitely come back as soon as he had a chance. Hearing these words, Woosun finally became furious, as he couldn't risk his life and let them turn back later and finish what they wanted. Therefore, his only option was to fight, and luckily, at that moment, he had every chance to win, for he wasn't the only one hostile against them. He had a dragon on his side, with fierce shouts that they should pay the price so that they would not dare to return again. He released his spiky vines in their direction, which in the next moment bound the legs of the fleeing guys, preventing them from moving. When they felt it, they looked down in bewilderment, trying to understand what had happened. They were indignant, for the thorny vines held their legs tightly. Not understanding how this could happen, they forcefully tried to break through. Even though the main character was not quite ordinary, he was still only a small flower for now, and so the strength of the two men was too huge for him. However, even though he was almost ripped out of the ground, he didn't plan to give up. With a fierce shout, he continued to hold their legs. Luckily, his strength was enough, and the two men fell face down on the ground with a clatter. A large pink egg fell out of his hands and rolled into the bushes, At the same time, the enraged dragon, glaring with its red eyes, was about to catch up with them. The brunette was puzzled as to what had stopped him, while the other was more concerned with where the egg had gone. However, they didn't have time to think about it, because the next moment, the guy raised his head and shouted shrilly that the dragon was already over their heads. Shouting words of help, they ran away with all their might, despite it was already useless to try to do anything. In the next instant, the dragon's huge clawed paws reached for them. Dragon mercilessly grabbed the guys who were screaming in fear and roared at them in such a way that his intentions were very clear at once. However, even though he was in the dragon's clutches, the blonde-haired boy, though confused and shitting his pants, was still not going to give up. Smiling and reaching for his sword, he said in a determined voice that he would fight to the last moment. Then he swung his sword, striking the huge reptile's paw. When it felt the pain, it let out a piercing scream. In the next moment, the brunette felt that the dragon's paw was no longer holding him. But this wasn't good news. In the next moment, he and his partner began to rapidly approach the ground, threatening to crash to death. However, Dragoness did not stop there. Being in a rage, she was not going to give them such an easy death. So in the next instant, she opened her jaws and rushed towards them at a great speed. A few seconds later, the screams disappeared. It was said that those guys were never seen again after that. Looking at the dust that had already begun to settle, as if unable to believe it, the protagonist wondered if those two people were dead. The realization that he had committed an indirect but still a murder made his body sweat, and he began to tremble. His reaction was quite normal, since for a boy of his age, murder was something very scary. However, he realized that he had no other choice, because if they had escaped, they would surely come back, and he would be the one to die. Wu Sun decided not to dwell on it, and thought that he had done it purely in self-defense and survival, so it was not his fault. However, in the next moment, another possible problem came to him. The dragon egg that had been lost in a hurry by those two guys, and which was currently lying nearby, making it likely that the dragoness would surely return later and kill everyone who would be nearby. Just then, he sensed an approaching danger behind him, causing him to turn around sharply. As expected, it was a dragoness flying low over the ground, but luckily, she never noticed the egg or him. As it flew past him, it began to shrink, turning into a small black dot, which Wu Sun looked at with fear until the last. The dragoness seemed to have disappeared, and he could finally relax. But no, his attention was immediately drawn to the pink egg sticking out of the bushes. However, as for the person who received the dragon egg, he didn't look too happy about it. He started shouting after the dragoness, irritated, asking why she didn't take her baby with her and if she didn't need it. But as expected, his shouting had no effect. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, he said that it was probably the first time she was becoming a mother. But even that didn't explain her neglect of her egg. Retracting his thorns on the vines to avoid damaging the egg, the protagonist reached for it. However, the distance was too great for him to reach. Fortunately, his yellow gecko friend soon appeared, casually returning from somewhere with a bowl in his hands. As he came closer, he looked at the protagonist in bewilderment, then turned his gaze to the egg. Seeing the free labor force, the protagonist turned to the gecko, who was still not understanding what was going on, and told him to try to push the egg to him. With zeal, he began to push it, but no matter how hard he tried, he could not. He couldn't even get it to budge. Finally, he was yellow Sisyphus couldn't even move his stone. Realizing that this would not do, Wu Sun called him over and began to show him something with his vines and explain the principle of leverage. But since the gecko would hardly understand, he told him to just do what he said. Following our flower's exact instructions, he found a large stone and placed it beside the egg and immediately set to work. Finding a stout stick and using it as leverage, he gritted his teeth and began to push it with all his might, while the protagonist, acting as moral support, encouraged him as best he could. As a result of their joint efforts, the gecko not without sacrifice, in the form of a bruise on his forehead, but still managed to move the egg. The egg bounced a little in the air and rolled straight towards Wu Sun, who happily noted that it was a success. As soon as it got close enough, his vines immediately wrapped around it. However, no matter how he tried to lift it, he was not strong enough to do so, nor could he absorb it due to its enormous size. Even his big mouth wasn't big enough. The option of smashing it was also immediately declined, because if it spilled on the ground, it would hardly be edible. Clutching his head, he irritably wondered what he should do with it, since he had nothing to help him devour it at the moment. However, his musings were interrupted by the sound of something crackling. For a moment it puzzled him, making him wonder what it could be. After a moment, however, when he looked at the egg and saw the crack in it, it was clear. A dragon was hatching from it. In the main character's head immediately appeared the image of a small, cute pink baby dragon, which in his opinion was about to be born into the world. In the next instant, the shell on top completely cracked, and a bright golden glow illuminated everything around him. However, to the bewilderment and surprise of the protagonist, not at all what he had imagined hatched out of the egg. A small, chubby girl with horns on her head appeared, and Wu Sun was stunned because the fact that the egg would hatch into an almost ordinary girl he clearly did not expect. In addition, she was immediately born in clothes. Looking at the weeping creature in front of him, he told himself that he should not be surprised, since he himself had turned from a boy into a flower. He looked more closely at the little girl who had stopped crying and noted that she had the horns and tail of a dragon, while her body looked human. Comparing these facts, he concluded that it was most likely a dragon girl. Suddenly, the little dragon girl grabbed the eggshell with her chubby little hands and began to chew it with her sharp little teeth. Seeing this, the protagonist in a panic wanted to stop her, saying that she should not eat the eggshell, but when he thought about it, he stopped. As a human, he had read many fantasy novels in which he had heard that as soon as a dragon hatches from its shell, it immediately eats it. Comparing the fact that he could have been in one of those fantasy worlds, which there was a lot of evidence for, he decided to leave everything as it was. By this time, the little one had eaten all the shells that were around and was now looking at the last one she was sitting on. Making the incomprehensible sounds inherent in all newborns, she took hold of the shell with her hands. Then, panting, she began to try with all her might to pull it out from under her. As a result of which, she succeeded in doing so, but at the same time, she lost her balance and fell on her back. Seeing this, Wu Sun said with a disdainful look that this kid must be pretty dumb. Losing sight of the last piece of eggshell, the little dragoness began to look around, and the first thing she noticed was our flower, which noticed her gaze too and tensed up. The baby dragoness immediately and happily crawled over to him, calling him Mom. Wu Sun was very shocked at what he heard and began to nervously glance at the gecko, asking if he heard her call him Mom. However, after he calmed down a bit, he thought about the possible reasons for her behavior. He remembered that he'd once heard that birds recognize the first creature they see after hatching from an egg as their mother. But he'd never thought that applied to dragons as well. And besides, what kind of mom could he be? He's a young guy, after all. But that fact, along with the prickles, didn't seem to bother the baby dragoness at all, who immediately rushed at him with hugs and joyful cries of "Mommy, Mommy." She was so insistent and heavy that the poor flower was barely holding on to the ground with its roots and trying to prove to her with reasoned arguments that she had it all mixed up and he was not her mother. Its stem was cracking from the strain, and the roots were beginning to pull out of the ground. But the little dragoness did not stop and continued to call him Mommy and piled all her weight on him. The poor flower began to think that she was doing it on purpose and was going to tear him out with the root, and began to beg her tearfully to stop and let him go. and surprisingly, she let him go. Wu soon exhaled a sigh of relief, but continued to lament that he was about to fall apart. Out of all this, the good news was that the little dragon girl seemed to understand his words. But that didn't mean she'd had enough cuddling, and she'd already spotted her next victim, a gecko, who, when he saw the look in her eyes, knew he was in trouble. Now it looked like he was going to be a plush toy for the little girl in addition to his job as a bug hunter and water carrier. But judging from her cries, she had mistaken him for her daddy. And now Wu Sun was not happy about what was happening, so he indignantly told her that she had gotten it all mixed up. And he was the father here, not the mother, and this gecko is here as the pet dog, not the father. The little baby dragon girl looked at him carefully, but still continued to clutch the poor gecko. But it seems she understood what he told her, as she set the frightened gecko on the ground, only to grab him again and hug him again, calling him doggy. The poor thing didn't seem at all happy about the role, and his look said it clearly instead of saying it. Wu Sun was glad that she understood him, and now realized who the gecko was. Calling her a smart girl, he asked who she thought he was now, but she didn't answer. Instead, she let go of the tortured gecko and stared at him intently. Then she showed him in no uncertain terms that she was hungry and wanted to eat. Wu Sun was not thrilled with the idea of sharing food. However, no one asked his opinion, and immediately after she spotted a dry leaf with bugs on it, she began to carelessly eat them without paying attention to the indignant cries of the disgruntled flower. In just a few moments, she ate every last beetle, leaving behind only a dry leaf. And it seems that now, after a good meal, she wanted to sleep. Wu Sun didn't mind if she slept anywhere, but she surprised him and crawled right over to him, laying down near his roots. She immediately fell asleep carefree like a real baby. Watching such cuteness together with the gecko, even the constantly disgruntled flower could not say anything against it. And she slept like that until the next morning, when the rays of the rising sun woke her up. Immediately after the baby dragoness woke up, she began to cry shrilly, demanding to be fed as soon as possible. She was hungry beyond belief. Wu Sun immediately began to calm her down and tell her to be quiet and stop crying because now he would send their dog for food. Our flower turned to his faithful dog with a very important task, to find as many beetles as he could, as quickly as he could. Gecko already had a leaf in his paws and was ready for such an important mission. As he ran off to hunt, Wu Sun tried his best to calm the little girl, assuring her that their faithful dog would soon return with plenty of food. But the little one still wouldn't calm down. Now he realized how hard it was to be a nanny, and how the constant crying gave him a headache. At last, the gecko returned from his hunt with a pile of bugs. The baby immediately began eating them, quite enjoying the process. While the also hungry flower and gecko could only swallow drool, Wu Sun even asked her not to finish all of them and leave at least one bug for Daddy. But as it turned out, those bugs weren't even enough for her, and as soon as they ran out, she cried again, demanding more. Wu Sun didn't understand how she could be so brazen, eat everything, leave everyone else hungry, and then demand more. Now the poor gecko had no choice but to go hunting again, while our little flower was left alone with a crying little girl. He realized that he was afraid of her appetite, just in case she decided to eat salad after a meal of bugs. After a while, the gecko returned again with a bunch of various bugs. Wu Sun had already lost a good amount of weight, and now took one beetle with trembling leaves and was about to eat it. The haggard gecko did the same, as he received nothing for his efforts. But looking among themselves, they realized that if they ate them, the little one would definitely not have enough. They couldn't even afford to eat, no matter what they deserved. They agreed that it was the fate of parents to take care of their little girl and give her everything. However, their tired and exhausted faces disagreed with them. Watching her eat one bug after another, Wu Sun was at a loss as to whether she was a dragon or a bird, or something in between. He wondered how fast she could grow on a diet of bugs. He realized with horror that as she grew, she would eat more and more. The poor gecko would be tired to death running around looking for bugs, and him being chained to one place couldn't help him in any way. Something had to be done.